Let's get started. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining this session titled UNIVERSUM Survey Results, LSU Students and Their Ideal Employers. My name is Josh Knudsen, and I'm a career advisor for the LSU Olin Career Center. Please make sure that you keep your microphones on mute and your video hidden for the duration of today's workshop. Should you have any questions during the session, please use the chat feature to send a message and make sure you send it to everyone so that the whole group will benefit from your questions as well. We will do our best to answer questions during this session. And if your question does not get answered, please let us know by contacting us at the end of the event. For the best session experience, please select speaker view in the upper right hand of your corner of your screen. And please note that this session is also being recorded. Now it is my honor to introduce our speaker, Laura Butts, Partner Relations Manager for US and Canada with UNIVERSUM.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Josh. Excited to be here today and go through our survey results with LSU. So I'll jump straight in. What we're going to cover today, the first few chapters apply mainly to the university itself, and then the last few chapters we're going to get more into the employers and the LSU students' perception of employers. And for a frame of reference before I begin, most of this data was collected from October of 2019 to March of this year, so just before COVID-19 and really started to hit the US, so good to keep that in your frame of mind when we review this. A big thank you to everyone at LSU that made this possible. And a little bit about UNIVERSUM, and for those who don't know, so essentially our role, we try to build bridges between employers searching for talent like the talented students at LSU and the students seeking employers and what they might want in those employers. So we work with these universities, partner with them to provide some background analysis to support data-driven decision-making. But first, LSU students, who are they? Who took the survey this year? Just under 800 of them in our sample this year globally. Our demographic profile, so mainly business students, that was one of the biggest hitters this year, engineering. We see a bit of a female skew in the gender split, but we found that women typically take surveys more, so quite often that's what we see. In terms of our diversity questions that we ask, ethnic background, as well as being a member of some diversity groups, we can see what the LSU population is reflected in who takes the survey here. So those of you familiar with UNIVERSUM, you're probably aware of our career profiles. It's one of the things that students get when they finish the survey. Essentially, it's like a personality profile, but who students are in their future careers, their career path. And you can see LSU's distribution is quite similar to all students: leaders, harmonizers, hunters. Leaders, for example, being ones who have high work ethic, taking charge, looking for advancement opportunities, and we see that reflected when we talk about what students are looking for in a school and an employer. But first, the skill sets of LSU students, so their self-perceived soft skills, as we call them. Well, overall, you can see where they think they really excel, especially compared to the all student sample. So LSU students here are going to be in light blue, all students in that dark blue. Work ethic quite strong, problem solving, positive attitude as well. On the other side, we see where the students might want to work on some of their skills, strengthen themselves a bit, time management, communication. I mean, I think we all understand that they're always trying to work on those two key things, definitely. In terms of their practical experience, so hard skills essentially, we see a lot of the leadership profile reflected in having a summer job, having a job not related to their area of study, so a lot of work experience, a good foundation there overall with the LSU students. On to one of the cores when we assess the university itself, how we evaluate the perception of the school. Well, we have four main drivers: reputation, offering, culture, and employability. And under those four drivers, we have 40 attributes, positive, desirable attributes that students can say they associate with the school, they find attractive in general, and most importantly, where there's that intersection where we see the key highlights of what's attractive and associated. But first, what do students think about LSU? What's the first thing to pop to mind? Well, football being number one, but you can see in this word cloud, students could portray whatever they thought were their top associations with the school. So some things I noticed that stuck out to me was a lot of the pride, the heritage, tradition, prestigious, pride, spirit, and of course football. Who could forget football? And you see how LSU compares to the all students group here. So a lot of emphasis on specific LSU things like Tigers, for example, but some similarities as well when you see, for example, opportunities and opportunity. So if LSU students got a do-over in the college selection process, what would they do? Well, 67% would stay with the school, and that being higher than the average above all. But there is a 23% that say they might choose a different school in the US. So we can take a deeper dive there. Of that 23%, where might they go instead? Well, I'll call these top 10 their competitor schools because they're the alternative choices to 23% of that 23%. But we can talk about this a bit more when we get into the attributes, what's associated with the school, because these attributes down here highlighted in blue are more associated with these competitors. So just something to keep in the back of the mind when we talk about what's associated with LSU. But first, how did your students become your students? Well, I noticed that interpersonal relationships seem to matter quite a bit. So family having a big impact as well as friends, for example. Our framework that I mentioned in the beginning, so those 4 drivers with the 40 attributes you can see here, and students can pick and choose what they find associated and what they find attractive. So looking at the top 10, what's important? What are they looking for most in a university? So very similar overall to all students. I just highlighted 2 differences on one side versus the other in terms of what they're looking for. What they associate or what they are actually seeing at the school looks a little bit different. I highlighted, again, just 2 of the differences that popped on LSU side and not the all student side and vice versa. See heritage and tradition up quite a bit higher. Makes sense to me, seeing the word cloud with that word, the words like pride and heritage and tradition in there. So where do these intersect? Where do these overlap? Where do we see a correlation and equilibrium between the attractive and associated attributes? Well, in this intersection, you see these are the highlights. It's what your students find attractive and associated. So they're seeing it at the school and it's things that they want to see. So a lot of employability factors here, for example, good employment opportunities, as well as a good reference for future career. We can stress test these elements, so we have to hold them to a higher standard, a standard deviation away from the mean, and 3 of those make that stress test to be what we consider favorite attributes. So again, some of the employability factors like being a good reference for future career, but also the alumni factor and just being a friendly and open environment. Looking on the other side, what's attractive? What are the students looking for, but they might not see it to the same degree on campus? Affordability, one that I've seen pretty much every school struggle with, unfortunately, but you're not alone in that. And then of course, also a few offering elements and a reputational element. What's associated, but not necessarily as valued. So I call these the bonus attributes because they're of course great things that the students are seeing at the school, but not necessarily as highly valued. So offering quite a few here, as well as cultural elements. The next few graphs is how we can compare LSU's performance nationally. So we'll see with the percentages on the side what percentage of the students associate you with that attribute. This blue triangle is LSU, the average line, the dotted line, and then all the dashes are the different deciles that schools within the survey fall into. So it's a lot to unpack, but I'll highlight just a couple things to look at. So drives innovation, entrepreneurship, that was one that list of competitor schools from earlier did perform just a bit better in, but it's still important and associated by your students overall. And of course, with successful alumni, it's even more important. So the attributes are sorted by importance from the most important on the left to the least important on the right. So it's one that you do better in, on average, is attractive, associated, and it's even more important. Looking at the offering driver, so high quality programs, that it was again one that competitor schools perform just a bit better in, but it is still associated and attractive. Looking at variety of courses, you can see you're in the very top 10% of the survey, so congratulations on that. And it's one that was still very associated with the school. Looking at culture, again, just pointing out some where the competitor schools did do a bit better overall. But friendly and open environment, which is even more important than those two, is attractive and associated and above average there. Looking at employability, so this is one of your stronger drivers, the top two here being attractive and associated. And we can see overall how you fare. So of the 40, on average, a school has 18 associated with them, and you have 17. And you can see the distribution throughout the different drivers. Looking at the university ranking, so from 0 to 10, students could rank you. You can see your average this year is 7.3 out of 10, nationally being 7.6. And we can compare this over time. So 2020 has been a very interesting year in many regards, including with satisfaction ratings, because we did see quite a decline this year overall. For some reason, we're still coming up with a lot of theories, but you're not alone in that. It's been a national trend we've seen. So our next section, I'm going to jump into career services. So here we see what students are seeking in career service, what's most in demand, what they find they might lack or they want to see because they're not aware of. Well, visiting companies and organizations was the number one there, followed shortly by job search training. So this is what students would like to see at the school. What are they actually using? They're more aware of. Well, the number one here being career fairs, job fairs. It's pretty much always the classic up here. But also interestingly, for example, personality skills or testing is used more widely by your students overall. So we can compare the relationship here between the demand for a career service and the usage among students. So the top two quadrants in the next graph will be key in that there's relative more demand in both cases, but on the left there's relative less usage, and on the right there's relative more usage. So we can see where they all fall. Up in that upper left-hand quadrant, students might not be quite as aware of the resource, so they're not using it to quite the same extent. But up in the right-hand corner, like with career counseling, students are meeting a bit of an equilibrium there in the sense that they're using it quite widely, but they're also demanding it quite widely relative to all the other elements. And career fairs over here on the right, those are one of the key ones that students are using quite a bit, so they're not demanding it quite as much because they're already aware of and using it. But in terms of the students who said they don't use career services, which is 14%, we can see, well, why don't they? Well, most of them saying, of course, I'm too busy. A few saying it's too early, but I will highlight that few, quite small, 9%. But that 9% said that they're not aware of these services, so perhaps that's an area to target in terms of the messaging or the platforms used. So career service ranking, just like university ranking, we can see it's from 0 to 10, quite comparable to the average of 7.3 out of 10 compared to the 7.2 out of 10. Again, something we can look at over time. So you're not alone in the 2020 drop, of course. It's been a very interesting year overall. Looking at how to get that message out for career services, well, email, the classic good old-fashioned go-to. A lot of people say students don't read emails, and students say we get too many emails, but it's still the number one, even compared to social media, for example. So next we have our communication chapter. So we're going to cover how students prefer to interact with employers and what channels they're using to learn about potential employers. But first, we have a word cloud here of who impressed your students most with their on-campus recruiting. Looking at the list of who might be present today, I think there's some familiar names in there, but who impressed #1 overall? ExxonMobil. So they impressed most with whatever they did on campus. It could be a blueprint for the future because whatever they did was a success. And I took LSU's previous report, the 2019 word cloud, because I thought it was quite an interesting shift between who impressed differently. Looking at the different channels here, so of the 3 main mediums, print, digital, in-person, of course, students use on average a combination, 6, and 95% of those students saying digital is the go-to, but that's not to discount 83 or 64 saying in-person or digital, or in-person or print. Of course, that 83 might have to adapt a bit in a COVID-19 world, but we'll see how it fares for next year, the upcoming year. Looking at the 3 main mediums, looking at all students in the survey first. So what channels under each medium do students use the most to learn about potential employers? Well, we see social media being #1 for digital, career fairs being #1 for in-person, but how do LSU students specifically feel? Well, I'd say fairly comparable overall to all students. Social media dominating just a bit more, where we see career fairs, the employer websites, and the online job boards just a little bit less overall compared to all students. Sometimes these can be influenced by the age or the class year of the demographic pool. So, for example, younger students tend to not use job boards quite as often because they're not ready to, I guess, take that step quite yet. So speaking of online channels, again, continuing with an all students pool here, you need a pretty big pool of data. So to follow up on what channels they like to use, we know digital is quite popular in social media, but specifically where employers might want to focus their online efforts because it's where students are looking. So their career website, quite popular under, for example, most used online channels. Also in terms of what's being checked first and the most time spent on it. LinkedIn, also quite popular, as well as the general corporate website. So areas to really reach the audience through these different mediums. So once they get to those channels, once students are on your employer page or looking at the right medium, what do they actually want to see? So how to engage them? Well, the standouts here being advancement opportunities. They're very important to students in terms of what they want to see, how you might be able to increase engagement, as well as training and development also. So 51% saying it's very important to see, 40% saying important. So these are the areas, very forward-thinking students thinking about advancement opportunities and development opportunities. So we talked about who impressed on campus. This is who impressed with their social media presence. So Disney, it's always a classic, a cultural icon. So it's usually pretty big up there. But a few other ones as well that transfer over. For example, Chevron, I see once again Shell popping up again as well. So that's impressive social media, but what about unimpressive social media? So would a lacking presence on social media, subpar presence, impact your students' decision to consider that employer? Well, 2% said, nope, I would not work for them if I did not like their social media, which I'd say is about average from what I'm seeing at most schools now. And about a third saying, I'd be less interested overall, but the majority still 2/3 saying, it wouldn't really affect my decision, I'd still consider them. So a very relevant question in a COVID-19 world. Again, this was conducted before COVID-19 really hit, so I expect these percentages to change a lot in the next year. But in terms of last year, 27% of students said that they'd participated in a virtual job interview within the last 12 months. And of that 27%, 41% said that they were satisfied, meaning they gave it a rating of 8 or above. So our final main chapter here will cover the employers themselves and LSU students, what they're looking for in employers, their preferences, as well as their ideal employer. So who's really on their wish list. But first, what do LSU students want to do after graduation? Well, 62% said that they will continue studying. That doesn't have to be immediately after graduation. The percentage is usually pretty high because students consider it at any point after their bachelor's, they can continue to study. Besides that, in terms of that first job after their bachelor's, well, a national company or organization is that number one at 30% here, followed by international company, SMEs, slightly more popular among your students, and after that, pretty inline, succinct. A few more entrepreneurs in your group looking to start their own business. Looking at preferred industries, so this is all main fields, all majors overall, and we can see number one being arts, entertainment, recreation, followed by hospital and healthcare overall, to an even greater extent than the all students pool. But perhaps even more telling is looking at it specifically by the different main fields. So I took two examples here, the first one being business, so business driving that arts, entertainment, and recreation push. And then you can see marketing, advertising, PR, consulting, financial services, and technology. Typically, I see banks and fintech a little bit higher in this list, so LSU students a bit unique in that regard. Engineers, aerospace and defense looking to be number one here, but following closely by engineering, and engineering more popular for your students relative to all students, energy, sorry, not engineering, and energy not being too surprising to me, considering a lot of the big energy companies that have been in the word clouds in terms of who's impressed your students. But one way to break this down is by looking through the lens of gender. So there's more women in the survey overall, but in terms of all the main top industries or preferences, we can see how the split goes proportionally, more females, more males, mostly obviously female dominated since there's more in the survey. And again, perhaps more telling is by looking at main fields specifically. So business students, the one male dominated preferred industry here being that management and strategy consulting. So what size of employer are your students looking for? Well, smaller actually on average. So 11 to 50, 51 to 250. I'd say that lines up with the students looking for SMEs to a slight greater extent. Of course, there's plenty of national companies on that smaller scale as well. It seems to align fairly well. I've seen quite a few reports where students say, I really want to work for a big international company, but their preferred employer size is 50 employees. So something doesn't always match up there. Looking at salary expectations and specifically the gendered salary gap. So again, this combines all main fields and majors, so that can throw things off essentially. And it also includes all regions of the country, so that can impact it. But on average, your gender gap there being just a bit higher than the all students with over 13,000 compared to men and women. Looking specifically at some main fields, perhaps is a bit more telling comparing apples to apples. So here we see the gap shrinks when you look just within the pool of business students specifically. Unfortunately, of course, still a gap, but better than looking at overall. So one interesting takeaway when we compare different groups within the salary expectations. So here we have a comparison of not only gender, but using our diversity questions, ethnic background within gender, so adding that extra dimension. So when we compare, actually, we see that Black Americans have the smallest gender gap or gender salary expectation gap, and South Asian Americans have the highest gap, so the the highest gender salary expectation gap between men and women. So I referred to our framework for assessing the university attractiveness earlier, but here we see our employer attractiveness framework. So it's very similar to the overall one for universities, just of course adapted to employer elements overall. So what are LSU students looking for in an employer? What are their top, I need to have these attributes in their wish list employer? Well, highlighted some of the differences here on your students compared to all students. So less cultural aspects, for example, for LSU students, a bit more focus on the remuneration and advancement and the job characteristics overall. But typically, the top ones, high future earnings, secure employment, pretty standard. I see that usually in the top 5, I would say. So your top 3, pretty identical overall. Just the bottom here, a bit different. You see the leaders, for example, that profile looking for leadership opportunities and opportunities to make a personal impact. Some of the other ones can transfer over flexible working conditions, encouraging work-life balance, very similar attributes on each side. So how has this changed since last year? Well, on the left here, I have LSU students this year, the attributes I just covered, what they're really looking for in an employer. And on the right, you'll see what they thought last year, what they were looking for in an employer last year. So some changes this year, actually. So the mindset's flipped just a bit. Again, more culture, or less culture this year. So people culture, not having quite as large of an impact. At the same time, again, we see a bit more on the remuneration and advancement opportunities, as well as the job characteristics. So you can see how their priorities might have changed just a bit this year compared to last year. Before we talk about our ideal employers, so how much of the talent do you have to reach to become an ideal employer? So we measure to get to that top 10%, how many students or proportionally do you have to impress? Well, if you're looking for computer science students, you have to reach out to a lot of them. You got to impress a pretty large percentage. But if you're looking for a student in business, for example, that percentage goes down. You don't have to reach and impress quite as many in the pool to crack that top 10. How do we get our ideal employer list? Well, for the students, depending on their major, they get a whole big list of potential employers. Through that list, they can choose as many as they would consider. So a handful, however many they want. Beyond that, they choose their ideal employers, their wish list. I really want to work for these guys. Well, there they can pick up to 5. And after that, they can choose if they have or will apply to any of those ideal employers. So our ideal employer list, who are LSU students really wanting to work for? First here, we have business. So I highlighted just a few things I saw. So in blue here, we see, for example, 2 of the big 4, and the big 4 in the word cloud popping up quite a bit, though we'll see in under trend. So this is the position in relation to 2019. The big 4, for example, going down just a bit. So Deloitte going down 5 spots, EY going down 3 spots, which is, I'd say, on trend with the national students as well. You see Deloitte down 4 nationally, EY down 4 or down 7 nationally. In orange, I highlighted some that had really impressed with their social media and on campus. So ExxonMobil being that #1 on campus recruiter, and IBM also popping up in that word cloud quite a bit. Interestingly, the FBI also going up quite a bit in the ranking, so up 11 spots to crack the top 10 this year. And when we looked at the preferred types of organizations they'd like to work for, public sector wasn't one of the big priorities. So interesting that a public sector area would climb so high this year for LSU students. So this is for business students at LSU. What about Engineering students, well, again, the trend here indicates their position, their rank in relation to 2019, highlighting a few things here. So definitely a lot of energy presence. So energy was, I believe, number 2 on the industry preferences. And we saw ExxonMobil, Chevron, Shell, all popping up in the impressive word cloud. So not too surprising to see them up in the ranks for engineering students. In blue, I highlighted some aerospace defense companies. They also impressing your students, and I believe aerospace and defense was number 1 in terms of the industry overall for your students, their preferred industry for engineering. So in terms of the data, that's what I have for you. I'm gonna run through a quick summary of what we've discussed, how to maybe apply some of these results, and then I'd love to hear from everyone else some questions, comments they might have. So looking at the attributes related to the university and some themes we've seen. So when we're looking at the important and attractive attributes, where those intersect, where to highlight yourself, because it's the successes of LSU, friendly and open environment, some of those employability aspects like the good reference for future career, good employment opportunities, as well as offering and reputation we see with the successful alumni and the high quality of programs. One theme that I took away after looking at the word cloud, as well as the ranking of the associations. So LSU students on average compared to all students have this greater association with heritage and tradition. It was number 2 in associations overall. And we saw in the word cloud words like spirit, heritage, tradition. Looking at the employer preferences, so arts, entertainment, recreation was the number 1 industry overall. It changes when you, of course, look at different main fields like engineering, for example. ExxonMobil was that most impressive with their campus recruiting. And in terms of where students would really want to work, organization type, national companies and organizations are overall number 1. LSU grads, though, when they're looking for a potential employer, 3 things they value the most: high future earnings, secure employment, and inspiring purpose. When we look at the career services, 86% in the survey had said that they use career services, but of that 14% who said that they don't, 9% of them said because they're not really aware of what's there. Though, of course, the main chunk of that 14% said that they were too busy. But overall, when we look at the rating this year, 7.2 out of 10, pretty comparable to that average of 7.3. Looking at the university side and what your students would do if they got a do-over in the college selection process. Well, most, more than the average sample would stay with you at LSU, but there is 23% that said that they would choose another school in the States, preferably, I believe UT Austin was number 1 there, alternative. But that rating of 7.3 out of 10, still not too bad, the average being 7.6. So how can this be applied? What do I hope you can take away a bit? So on the university side, hopefully you get a sense of understanding for what students want to see when it comes to career services, where there's maybe some more demand, or maybe they just need to be more aware of it, as well as how they want to learn about career services and the best channels to reach them. In terms of the students going into the labor market, their skills, so identifying where they think their strengths are, like with their work ethic, and where they might want some more help, like for example, with time management, communication, some areas that perhaps workshops or classes could emphasize a bit. And very related to our employer drive-through workshop today, attracting the relevant employers to cooperate with. So today we're doing a great thing, engaging with those employers who your students want to see. This is just backing it up with the data of who your students are aware of, like ExxonMobil on campus, who's impressing them, who they already want to work with, like Chevron being in the top for engineers. So you can really know who to work with in the future and what's impressing your students. And overall, with the attributes we discussed with what your students associate, what they find attractive, hopefully you get a sense of managing your brand in that knowing where to highlight yourself. So your students know where to highlight you. They're saying you have great employment opportunities, high quality programs. So those are things you can emphasize going forward in terms of recruiting new students and turning your current students into ambassadors for LSU. So thank you so much, everyone, for listening, taking the time to be here today. And thank you for all the wonderful staff at LSU who made this possible, who got the data, got the message out so we could do the analysis. So I'll turn it over to Josh, I believe, and give the screen back.
Thank you so much, Laura. That is awesome. This session, like I said, has been a part of our employer drive-in workshop for probably 6 or so years, and it is always so anticipated by employers to kind of see where they fall in the ideal student rankings and kind of what is priority for students at the time for that year. And we are so grateful that you shared this information. There are definitely a few points I can touch on, but I wanted to, before I did that and took the floor, open it up for any employer questions. I know we usually have some, so you could either use the chat or feel free to share your camera and your mic.
Perfect.
I see a question that just came in the chat, and it was about if they can find this information somewhere after this session. We did record this session, so it will be available to participants after. So we will make sure when we send the email with the evaluation, we also include the recordings that you would like to see. I know while we're waiting on other questions to come in, can you pull up, Laura, the slide on the important attributes? If you kind of toward the end, last 75%. I'm just thinking this might be a really great slide for employers to focus on as some of the things that also our student panel touched on, so that they can, employers maybe can work these into any types of presentations or job descriptions if they feel their company aligns with what it shows here that students are looking for in their top 10 attributes. I know that, you know, sometimes we're in situations, me currently being in one with an organization I serve, is, you know, I think I am presenting or managing a process that will work best for people who are going to be participating in that process, but I don't really ask the participants if it's going to be what they're expecting or what they're wanting out of it. And so I think this is a great opportunity to look and see what our students truly are looking for and how we can highlight these things to those students as we're presenting ourselves as employers to students. Let's see, it looks like, yes, I think people are just asking for the presentation. Are there any other questions right now? We have a few minutes left. Okay, I think maybe one of the other things, if you can expand upon initially a little earlier in the conversation, you had talked about the career preference types, harmonizer, hunter, things like that. Can you elaborate a little bit more maybe on those top three so we can help our employers get a clear picture of kind of what those students are maybe valuing or looking for?
Yeah, for sure. Great question. So I believe it's leaders, harmonizers, and internationalists, if I remember correctly. So each of those profiles comes with different things that they're really looking for, different goals in terms of an employer. So leaders, for example, they're looking for those leadership opportunities, also typically looking for leaders to help with their development, their advancement, looking for those chances to make an impact, to climb up within the company. Looking at harmonizers, they're very team players, problem solvers. They work very well in terms of getting the job done when it needs to get done. They're not necessarily the ones taking charge, but definitely ones to cooperate well with their coworkers, and looking for a lot of cultural and people elements like respect for its people, friendly work environment, work-life balance, that creative and dynamic environment. Internationalists, they are typically looking for, big internationalist companies. Reputation and image tends to matter quite a bit, as well as a lot of job characteristics, opportunities for relocation, also looking quite often at development themselves, looking for large opportunities to cooperate with their fellow co-workers, looking at the people and cultural element. In that sense, flexibility there as well. And in the deck that I'll provide in the appendix, there will be a description. I just did a brief overview of the different main profiles, but you can see the different strengths they have, where some of their improvement areas might lie, as well as the things that they typically look for in an employer.
That is awesome. Thank you. We did have a question just come through. I'll read it for you. You mentioned a disconnect between students choosing national, international firms while also choosing companies with smaller employee populations. Which do you or the data believe is the bigger driver, company size or employee numerical size?
That's a great question. So from what I've seen and what I'm assuming students who make this disconnect are thinking, so if they want to work for Amazon, we'll say Amazon being thousands of employers, they might only be thinking of their local Amazon office, which may be a couple hundred. So there could be a disconnect in that sense of students not really knowing the scale of the companies. So I would say the employer type is probably a bit more reflective, that they're more sure in, I want to work for a big international company, but maybe they're not thinking of all the employees in the company. They're just thinking their area, their office.
Yeah, that's really insightful. That's interesting to think about, right? And I guess another final question that kind of came to our mind, and I know you haven't necessarily been with UNIVERSUM for a super long time, but my gosh, you're so knowledgeable and you may or may not be able to contribute to this, but I'm just wondering if you have any, or maybe seen any employers that use this information to help craft their strategy on a certain campus. I mean, is there any best practices, or is that kind of something once y'all do the survey and present the information, at that point you kind of plan for the next survey and that gap closes with y'all?
So I myself don't work directly with the employers, but we definitely have people in our office that do that specifically help them brand their recruitment, what they are reaching out to students with. So their, for example, materials that they use online, what channels they specifically use online. Discussed a bit about how, for example, social media is one of the biggest platforms. We have people that help with the social media design, like what students are really looking to see. For example, in that graph that said advancement opportunities are one of the dominant things that students are really looking for. We're not just going from one survey to the next. Hopefully we're trying to apply this best we can. So there's definitely a lot of companies using it to measure themselves, measure what they've already done in terms of how it impacts students, how they're reaching out, as well as planning for future strategies.
Awesome, awesome. Well, that's great. This has been so helpful. And again, I am so appreciative for anybody who might have joined in after the first minute or two. Laura is in Sweden, so it is now probably almost 9 o'clock her time. So we are so grateful for you and sharing a few moments with us, especially at the time of day it is there. And this is all wonderful information. And I always appreciate our partnership that we have with UNIVERSUM, and I absolutely appreciate getting to know you through this process and you being so gracious with your time and your information to share it with us and our employers. And I'm sure if anybody has any follow-up questions, would it be okay if they contacted you directly?
Yeah, of course. Feel free to pass along my email. Feel free to shoot me an email with any follow-up questions. I'm happy to oblige.
Thank you so much. If you were here in person, we'd give you a big round of applause. So thank you so much. We appreciate it and have a great night.
Thank you so much. You've been a joy to work with. Big thank you to everyone at LSU again who made this possible, and all the employers who tuned in as well.
Good, good. Well, we appreciate you and have a great one. Thanks, Laura.
Great, thanks. Have a good rest of the day, everyone.
Yes.